Okay, now in this lesson, we're going to start to set off the final render of our main project. Okay, so here's where we are now left off. So at this point now, we are completely finished with all of the modeling, all the texturing, rigging, animation, particle dynamics, and we've pretty much got all of our lighting finalized and set up. So at this point now, we're really ready to set off our final render. So the process of going through and outputting our final render, it's really not going to be that much different from what we have already been doing. But before we set off our final render and really commit to this, there's always a few things that you should do as far as just double checking some of your render settings and just making sure that everything is going to be good to go before you commit to all the time required for your render. So let's start by once again going into the render settings, and let's just double check some of our settings in here. The first thing that we're going to do is double check our output. So at this point, this is where we need to set up the height and width of our final render. So let's say we go with something like 1280 by 720. We can also come in and use a few of these presets if we choose. So we can click on this little button right here. That'll pop up in this little menu where we have lots and lots of different presets that we can choose from. Or, like I said, you can just type in your height and width values manually here. Now, when it comes to outputting our final animation, this is what we really need to be concerned with, our frame range. Now, whenever we've been rendering into the picture viewer, we've only been rendering the current frame. But when it comes to outputting our final animation, what we can do is set this to just render all frames. And now the next time we render into the picture viewer, it's going to render out our entire animation from frame 0 and then end at frame 60. So we'll take a look at that here in just a moment. Before we commit to this, again, as I mentioned in one of the earlier lessons, you always want to make sure and double check that you haven't at some point in your project turned on this render region. Otherwise, whenever we set off our final render, we're just going to wind up with a partial image, so make sure that this is not enabled. And then when it comes to saving out our final renders, this is where we can basically choose the actual path. So we can really save these out anywhere we want. Let's go ahead and just browse. And in this case, I'll just put this into the Introduction to Cinema 4D project that we've been working out of. Might just come in here and make a new folder. We can call this Final Render. Double click in here, and then we just need to define the file name. So there we go. At this point, we are pretty much good to go. Now the last thing that we need to determine is the output format. So if we pull this down, you can see we have lots of different formats that we can choose from. Up here toward the top, we have a number of different image sequences that we can choose from. So whether or not we're going to output a JPEG sequence, a bitmap sequence, Targa sequence, and what any of these options will do is essentially render out a single image for every single frame that we have. So using any of these options, we'll wind up with, in my case, because my timeline is 360 frames long, I'm actually going to wind up with 360 individual images in this folder. Now, we also have the ability to render out as something like a QuickTime or an AVI if we choose to do that. Now, my recommendation, personally, would be to actually avoid using either of these two options. And the reason for that is that if you're in the middle of your render, let's say around frame 200, and then let's say maybe the power goes out, the application crashes, any number of things can happen. Well, if the render stops or your machine loses power halfway through the writing out of one of these files, the file won't be fully generated, which means it's essentially corrupt. And unfortunately, that means you've basically got to start your render all over again. You've wasted all that time. However, if you choose one of these image sequence options, as soon as that frame has been rendered out, we now have an individual image. So if the render crashes or stops or I lose power at frame 200, I've already now written out 200 individual images. So I've not lost any work. At that point, all I would have to do is reopen Cinema 4D, tell the renderer to start again at frame 200, and pick right up where I left off. I don't have to worry about ever losing any work like this. So again, my recommendation would be to always use an image sequence. And here in just a minute, I'll talk about how you can change your image sequence into an AVI or a QuickTime once it's been generated. So for me, I like to usually go with something like a Targa sequence. I find a Targa is a pretty good mix between really nice image quality, but fairly manageable file size. And as a couple of last-minute adjustments, we can come in here and double-check things like our physical settings. At this point, I'm pretty much leaving everything really just set to the default. The only thing that I have enabled is motion blur. Now, when you enable the physical renderer, as we have here, you'll start to notice things like your anti-aliasing. A lot of these options become grayed out. Again, these are overridden by the physical settings. If I set this back to a standard, we now have a lot more control over that. But again, in my case, I'm really not going to have to worry about this because I am going to be relying on the physical renderer. So with that chosen, about the only thing that we may want to choose or change here in the anti-aliasing is the filter. And at this point, that's really about the only thing that we can change. So right now it's set to a cubic, which is going to be good for a still image. As the name suggests, I like to set this to a Gaussian, so that will be a little bit more suited for animation. A little bit softer, it's a little less prone to some of the pixel jittering that we can sometimes get with more of the sharper images. But again, really just depends on what you are trying to render out. And at this point, pretty much everything else is using more or less the default values with global illumination and ambient occlusion. Okay, so once we have everything set up, our height and width, our start and end frames, and the output directory, we're pretty much now ready to render. And the way that we render out our sequence is exactly the same process that we've been using up to this point. All we would have to do is just render into the picture viewer. And again, the keyboard shortcut for that is going to be Shift-R. So at this point now, it's going to go through and start my initial pre-pass. So this is going through the global illumination calculation. So it's going to go through this layered process. Now at this point, the renders are going to be pretty lengthy. You can easily use several hours, and for more complex scenes, you can easily wind up spending a couple of days rendering, and that's just unfortunately part of it. So if you're unsure about what exactly you're going to be getting out, it's always maybe a good idea to maybe test 5, 10, 15 frames at maybe half resolution before you commit to possibly burning a couple of days rendering out your final animation. Okay, and then once our render is complete, here inside the picture viewer, we should have something like this. So let's set this back to 100% in my case. And at this point, we could just scrub through the picture viewer and play through our animation. So you can see here is the aircraft lifting off, shoots up into the sky, and then flies away. Now here's something that I really want to point out to you, and this is something that you may not even notice, but it can sometimes sneak up on you. If you look carefully at my final render, maybe try to find a frame where this is maybe a little bit easier to see. If you look very closely, you might notice a few of these little blocks. So if you look closely, you can see sort of a line here, and as I start to move through my animation, you can see where there's sort of these odd little blocky patterns that can sometimes appear. Now, what I find sometimes causes this is the physical renderer combined with global illumination. So if you look, you can sort of see this little spot on the wing that is sort of staying in place. So here's what I find is a pretty good solution to avoid that. So whenever rendering out in something like the physical renderer, but still using global illumination, what I find, again, will sort of help alleviate this problem, is instead of using the global illumination here, which is going to be perfectly fine if you're using something like the standard renderer, if using the physical renderer though, like I said, this is where we can maybe start to run into some problems. So in this particular scenario, what I'll do is disable my global illumination here, go into the physical settings, and we can enable direct illumination from this area instead. So we can turn on global illumination here, and this should now be much better suited to the physical renderer. And we get a couple of benefits here. The physical renderer combined with this method of global illumination is usually going to render out a little bit faster, and I sometimes find that it's a little less prone to flickering and some of the other artifacts that we can wind up with, like I just showed you. So at this point, now my global illumination is turned off, but it is turned on now here in the physical renderer. At this point, now if we wanted to maybe add a little bit of indirect illumination bounce, we could set that to 1 or 2. In my case, I'll probably just leave this set to 1. And once again, let's render this out. Just Shift R on my keyboard. So this is going to now go through, and you'll notice it is much, much faster. It doesn't go through that global illumination pre-pass, so it jumps right into the render. Again, this could take hours, maybe even a couple of days, depending on the complexity of your scene and how fast your computer is. So let's let this finish out. Okay, and once this completes, if we jump now toward the later part of my animation, again, now as this aircraft starts to fly away, you notice that we don't have those same little blocky artifacts that I had before. So this is going to be much, much better. And again, as sort of a benefit, this render was able to actually complete a little bit faster than the one that I set off previously. So just a few things to be aware of as you are going through your final animation. So as I mentioned, once we set off our final animation as an image sequence, we have just a ton of individual images now to work with. And if I go to my Cinema 4D project and go into this final render, here we go. You can see all of the individual images or the individual frames that have been rendered out. So if we wanted to take this now and convert this into a QuickTime or an AVI, we could do this right here inside of the picture viewer. So if I just select my folder here that contains all of my rendered images, we could just come in here and we could just right-click on the folder and go to Save As. And at this point, we can save out a still image, or we could save out an animation. Now once we set this to an animation, then we could choose maybe to save this out as something like a QuickTime or an AVI. Now that all the individual frames have been rendered, and now that they all exist, now at this point it's completely safe to convert these to a QuickTime or an AVI for your final output. So set up your options here if you need to, hit OK, and there you go. Alright, so that will now pretty much bring us to the close of this little final project that we've been working on for the last several lessons. Now, in the next section, Justin is going to pick up and start to talk about MoGraph, which is a phenomenal feature inside of Cinema 4D that's going to be really, really good for creating really complex motion graphics effects with very little effort.